I don't see how we're going to get to 98 new hires this year if we've only had 13 so far. So clearly, we need something else.
Well, that's citywide council member Sarah Nelson breaking it down. In a recent Public Safety and Human Services Committee meeting, she wants a new approach to police hiring. Councilmember Lisa Herbold, who chairs the committee, wants a different approach too. And hang on, now the mayor's got a plan as well. Well, the discussion about the future of the SPD has turned into a three-path choose-your-own-adventure story for the city of Seattle. We're discussing that, a study of police alternatives, pay-up gig worker legislation, Roe versus Wade fallout, and so much more here on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel here. The views expressed on this program are my own, and I am joined by none other than David Croman of the Seattle Times. And David, maybe it was covering the opening of boat season this past weekend, but it seems like the unseasonably cold weather might be bringing you down a little bit. I don't know if it's unseasonable or wrong seasonable because the highs of 52 are basically what we should be having in February. How you doing, man? How you holding up?
Well, I generally do okay with Northwest weather. I mean, I grew up here, so I'm used to it. But I
Right.
also have a big garden, and the colder things stay, the slower things grow, and it means I've got all these tomatoes inside that I can't put outside yet. So it's really delaying my harvest.
Okay. All right. Well, I know the tomatoes always come late at my place too, and I think it's going to be really late this year. So
Yeah.
thanks for breaking that down, man. And thanks as always for joining me. Thanks also to City Grind Espresso, our background noise sponsor for the audio podcast. Check them out on the first floor of City Hall. And thanks especially to our patrons. If you listen, folks, we need you to support the show. Would love to send you a Seattle News, Views, and Brews coffee mug. These are for our $10 a month supporters. You'll be featured on our mugshot of the week. And this week, it's Jackson sending over a shot from Pokemon headquarters in Bellevue with an imposing-looking character above. David, help me out here. I believe that's Charizard from Super Smash Bros., and I needed to do some research on this. But if you're looking for a character with double jumps, great kill moves, and kill power, Charizard's the character for you. Would you agree, David? Are you more a Pikachu kind of guy? What do you got for me here?
I missed the Pokemon thing. So
Mm-hmm.
while I know the names that you just said, I don't know anything about them.
Perfect. Nor do I. I was going to throw in Ivysaur and Squirtle, but I don't know if that could help us at all. But anyway, thank you, Jackson, for sending that in, and thank you for supporting the show. Jackson, listening on his commute. I know a bunch of you listeners are, so please do join Jackson and support Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. We're on Converge Media too. The video of the podcast airs on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, we are off and rolling with right here, right now. All right, folks, I'm going to try to catch you up on where we are with the police hiring bonus saga in Seattle. So Councilmember Herbold chairs the Public Safety Committee. She's got an ordinance on the agenda this week she wants to pass on for a full council vote. That would set aside about $650,000 from the surplus money SPD is going to have here because it's going to fall short on its hiring plan of 125 officers for this year. So we're getting some clarity on the numbers now. Looks like about 55,000 would go to a half year's worth of a recruitment specialist, the rest towards relocation bonuses for officers, as she is calling them. Now, Councilmember Nelson wants to keep all the surplus, about $4.5 million if the SPD hires 98 officers. And again, it's only hired 13 so far this year, but all that surplus would go back to the SPD to create hiring bonuses of some sort. And then Nelson was saying she had the backing of Mayor Harrell, but oh no, you don't. Now the mayor may present a plan to the council, we are hearing. David, I got to tell you, my head is spinning a little bit on this. What could the mayor present that's going to be different? How are you trying to sort this one out?
I don't. Yeah, it was interesting reading. That Councilmember Nelson interpreted an endorsement from the mayor's office, but then the mayor's office was like, "Well, not exactly. We were just saying she should go ahead and
And
present
work on
whatever she
that. Yeah.
likes, and
Mm-hmm.
she's welcome to do that. Not that we will necessarily support it." Um, I don't know. I mean, I was last week. I was actually listening to this by old, it was about a month old interview that Mayor Harrell had done on Cairo, I think. I was looking for something transportation related, but he mentioned, the question of hiring or how to hire more officers had come up, and
Mm-hmm.
it was interesting. He wasn't fully convinced that the signing bonuses were actually going to be the thing that did it. Which I thought was kind of fascinating. He didn't rule them out, but he also didn't kind of fully commit to it. And I think that kind
Right.
of reflects that at least at this point, there's not a ton of certainty around the effectiveness of signing bonuses at this point. And we've talked
Hmm.
about this before, which is
Yeah.
lots of departments are offering them, and there was kind of mixed results of the previous signing bonuses,
Hmm.
and so I think maybe that's what we're hearing, getting a little bit from the
Mm,
mayor's office is
right.
I'm not sure that they're entirely convinced that dedicating $14 million or whatever it might be
Yeah. Yeah.
really for signing bonuses is necessarily the best way to spend the money. But
Right.
maybe they might end up there eventually. But
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
imagine they're just kind of checking it out and figuring out what they want to do.
Right. It could be closer to 4.5 million, but it actually could be greater than that because, as I say, 13 officers hired so far in this plan for the Seattle police, who we're talking about 125 at the start of the year. But I look at these excess dollars, or these surplus dollars, if you want to call them that, David, and I think about another layer on top of this, too, that I know the mayor's been talking about, and that is $150 million worth of a budget gap there. So, in looking at this, I mean, we're talking about some real dollars here potentially. Every little bit counts, and not that 4.5 million is a little, but this is one of those parts of the discussion I think that is going to come up too. This budget gap is a very pressing issue for the mayor and the city council as they go through the rest of this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it's always the mayor's kind of, at least initially, the mayor's responsibility to kind of figure out where the money's coming from and how to close those gaps. I mean, the
Hmm.
city council, of course, makes changes, but in the grand scheme of things, those changes are often not that dramatic. I mean, it's certain, tens of millions of dollars perhaps allocation, but when you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, I mean, a lot of
Hmm.
that is going to fall to the mayor. And so, we see this a lot with between mayors and councils, which is the mayor is going to be more likely to kind of look in interesting places to close budget gaps and fill out the budget that they want. And so I would be surprised to see him sort of commit to certain dollars,
That's
uh,
fair. Yeah.
get ahead of
Yeah.
himself.
Yeah, it's early. It's early yet, too. And just to be clear on this, folks, the council's budget for this year, passed last November, included $355.5 million for the SPD. So enough to pay for all the current officers, plus an additional 125 hires. So the council approved this hiring plan last year. But with that, there was this budget proviso that prohibits the department from spending any excess funds derived from unfilled positions. So no matter where the council goes on this, that proviso would have to be lifted in some way. We'll see if they go with some plan that's a lot like Councilmember Nelson's or Councilmember Herbold's, or who knows what the mayor's going to come up with here. But some interesting work here. Lifting that proviso is the key to all this one. So we'll keep an eye on that. But I did want to talk about something else in the Public Safety Committee this week, alongside this discussion of hiring bonuses, talking about the police alternatives. The committee's talking about this week. So the council recorded a statement of legislative intent, as it's called, last November. All 9 council members at the time approved it, saying that the SPD should provide quarterly reports on the police department's effort to identify a non-sworn officer response to 911 calls. So this report from the SPD was due on April 1st. They don't have it just yet, and it plays off this finding from the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform. Best acronym ever, Nick Jr. here. So the institute found that up to 70% of SPD calls do not require a law enforcement response. And in the short term, a program should be developed to handle 12% of calls without sworn officers. Just want to make sure you have all the background here, folks. So Interim Chief Diaz has now responded, not with a report per se, that was due back on the 1st, but he's got a letter that says, hey, this Nick Jr. finding is great, but, and I'm quoting the chief here, more than 97% of all calls received by the CSCC, those are the 911 folks, resolve differently than they're initially classified. In reality, it's not possible to accurately predict the outcome of every call. I thought this was very interesting, David, because this battle towards finding police alternatives, I think there's some agreement that this needs to happen, but there are so many unknowns when a 911 call out is in progress. And I think the chief is highlighting that here.
And that was always my read. I mean, I did some coverage in 2020 just
Hmm.
around crisis response, or and what sorts of things police might not respond to. And
Yeah.
I had done a ride along with a cop on the crisis team, and that
Hmm.
was kind of what he was saying, which I thought was interesting, which is that he would agree that there's a lot of calls he ends up going to that he didn't need to go to.
Hmm.
And probably doesn't want to go to because he has a lot to do. But the challenging part is kind of the front end on that, is how do you get enough information, and how do you convey enough information to the officers so that they know in advance who should be deployed where.
Hmm.
So it's, as Chief Diaz mentioned, in retrospect, it's much easier to kind of figure all that out. But
Hmm.
in real time, how do you know that the person that the call for, we went to a call where it was like a drug overdose.
Yeah.
But when we got there, the drugs that this person were taking were prescription drugs, and it was not,
Mm,
um, they didn't need to be there. But,
I
they
see.
didn't
Yeah.
really figure that out until we
Hmm.
actually arrived at the scene. And so that,
Right.
that is pretty tricky to kind of gather that information in advance.
Right.
And I think that is, in general, a major hurdle that the city's going to have to overcome to figure out how you do these alternative responses.
Agreed. And I think what the chief is trying to say is we have these officers that are trained in a lot of different things. So let's put someone on scene who can handle everything, not just this certain smaller subset of things that maybe a social worker could do or whatever else. But then at the same time, David, I'm thinking about this because sometimes when a uniformed officer shows up on the scene, that can actually lead to some of these repercussions of situations that the police department doesn't want, shootings, etc. Do you see that back and forth there? I think that's part of the balance here too.
Definitely, yeah, definitely. I mean, for a lot of people who end up in these bad situations or who in crisis have had a lot
Hmm.
of interactions with police
Yeah.
before, and not always positive ones. And so
Hmm.
the sight of a police officer can at times sort of serve to escalate a problem even further.
Yeah.
The thing that I guess I'm more curious about lately, which is, there it is a complicated thing to do, but it's not like it's never been done before, because
Mm.
there's a lot of attention being paid to the Cahoots program in Eugene, and a lot of
Yep.
attention being paid to the STAR program in Denver. And I
These are
haven't
all
done a
non-sworn officer alternatives. Yeah. Keep going.
right. I haven't been to these places or really talked to people on the ground at these
Hmm.
places, so maybe there's some nuance that I'm missing. But
Mm.
my impression is these programs have been up and running for a
Yeah.
while, and
Yeah.
seem to be successful. And so it is complicated, and there are, obviously, some nuances that are required to kind of figure out how you know in advance who should show up at these calls. But there are
Hmm.
cities that are doing this, and
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
I don't entirely understand, and not to say that there isn't a lot of work being done behind the scenes that I don't
Hmm.
know about, but I don't entirely
Right.
understand why more kind of precedents haven't been brought to bear that have been
Yeah.
kind of tested out in Denver and in
Yeah,
Eugene.
what's worked in other places. And so my understanding here, David, the chief is beginning what he calls the risk manage demand, or RMD project, working with the mayor's office on this. So it's basically a chart that kind of plays off the likelihood of risk and consequences when a 911 call comes in. We're supposed to see a report on this late spring, early summer. I'm just trying to look at this effort because my question with the SPD, do they want to figure out ways that they can use fewer officers? Maybe they have to right now just because their numbers are so low. Some thoughts about where the Chiefs' allegiances lie on this, maybe.
I think, I don't know what's in their hearts, but I
Yeah.
mean, I haven't met someone in law enforcement yet that doesn't basically agree that there should be alternative responses to some
Hmm.
things.
Yeah.
I mean, the first thing they say is that they want kind of even further upstream responses,
Of course. Yeah.
fix poverty
Hmm.
basically, and fix
Of course.
homelessness. Um, but at the same time, yeah, I mean, I haven't really talked to anybody in law enforcement who has been kind of a fierce defender of responding to mental health crises or drug overdoses, or these are, I think, a lot of these people got into this profession because they want to catch bad guys, or whatever.
Hmm.
And so,
Yeah. They want to make
I
a
don't
difference. They
know.
want to help. Yeah. Hmm.
Right. I don't know that there would be a lot of fierce defending of, um, kind of handling these situations
Yeah.
differently. But at the same time, I do think that there are questions around who that is, what kind of training they will have, and
Absolutely.
what will happen when things go south.
Hmm.
Can you get, even if most interactions for someone in a mental health crisis are almost in, even if the vast majority of them end in, peaceful,
Yeah.
uh, have kind of peaceful resolutions, what do you do
Hmm.
in those relatively rare, but not totally unheard of situations where it escalates, and you do need to put hands on somebody? How do you
Right.
handle that? Um, so on the one hand, haven't heard a lot of opposition to giving up some of these calls, and have also encountered a lot of skepticism that it's as easy as sending out social workers or what have you.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're going to see what the chief has to say about this later on this spring, early summer. But up next, we're talking about a process that has taken more than a year to develop here, figuring out a minimum wage and other protections for gig workers in Seattle. It's nearing a vote for the Seattle City Council. We're going to talk about PayUp coming up on Now Hear This. Okay, so last week, the City Council held a public hearing on some new legislation it's considering called PayUp. So, this is to guarantee a minimum wage and other protections for gig workers. The council has been discussing this for more than a year. The city put minimum wage protections in place for Uber and Lyft drivers last year. Now they're moving on to folks like DoorDash, Care.com, and others here. So, two competing lines of thought emerged from this public meeting. One from drivers who say they need this minimum wage just to survive, and from the app companies who say a measure like this will increase costs for everyone and lead to less work for gig workers in the long run.
Forcing people to accept low wages is another way to disenfranchise people and force them into poverty.
We are opposed to PayUp as introduced and feel the council should pause to study and fully understand its impact to the community before it is passed.
Well, David, just some thoughts about this legislation. There's a bit of deja vu for me here because a lot of these arguments sound like what we heard about in 2014 when Seattle passed its minimum wage ordinance for all workers out there. How do you think PayUp might affect the gig worker economy? Some thoughts on that?
I don't. Yeah, I was thinking of the minimum wage debate also, almost verbatim.
Yeah.
So far, I don't. I think the general consensus is Seattle's $15 minimum wage. Maybe there were some marginal effects, but for the most part, you don't hear anyone saying that Seattle shouldn't have done that at this point. So I think in Seattle, especially, those arguments aren't going to hold a lot of water because especially in hindsight, every politician who has run for office since 2014 has sort of it becomes kind of a running joke in Seattle politics that basically every Seattle politician has claimed credit for raising the minimum wage.
That's true. Yeah.
It's a wildly popular. It was a wildly popular initiative to take.
Yeah.
It has
Shama
aged.
Sawant started it. Ed Murray grabbed
Right.
onto it. Yeah, keep going.
It has aged well. It was Seattle. Seattle had done its thing before Bernie Sanders had kind of taken up his $15, and so it's politically it's gonna. I don't see anyone wanting to be kind of on the anti side of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
The gig worker thing, though, of course, is really interesting because there's a lot more debate around how much the workers are actually earning as is, because it's really it's kind of unclear when you're supposed to be counting when they're earning money. So the companies like to count kind of the time that they're actually like responding to a job. They're they're engaged. They've gotten the job. They're driving there. They're doing the job.
Right.
Whatever. And so that if you just count that, then yeah, they're making good money. But if you sort of factor in all the other hours of when they're not getting a job, when they're looking for a job, it becomes a little more difficult. And so that that's a big difference around this debate versus minimum wage, which is minimum wage. We knew what the minimum wage was.
Sure.
At this point, we've seen these companies, DoorDash or whatever, saying that their drivers are earning $28 an hour.
Right.
And then push back against that claim at the same time. So it is like the minimum wage in a lot of ways, but unlike it in that there's not really even a shared sense of what the earnings are today.
Right. And that's why there's a transparency piece of this legislation in PayUp, which the council wants to pass here, and also a flexibility piece in that they want to make sure that if and when these gig workers turn down gigs, they don't get disincentivized from work, because that can happen a lot too. These apps will say, you got to do this job, you got to do this job if you want to stay on the top list here or whatever else, and it can turn into a race to the bottom. A lot of workers would say. But I just wanted to go with this back and forth argument here. So you've got people with the app companies. Actually, Sarah Nelson was pushing on this too, saying there's so many moving parts here. You're trying to take care of these drivers for DoorDash as well as these workers for Care.com who could babysit your kid, look after an aged parent, or Rover, they could walk your dog. So you're trying to put together these very different app companies here and try to put together legislation that would cover all of them. So they're saying we need to put a pause on this. Workers, of course, are saying we're in a crisis. We need this money now. But I just look at this whole thing because it's going to have to be implemented by the Office of Labor Standards here. And I'm just trying to figure out, how do you create these rules for an industry that seems to be coming out with different gig worker apps every couple weeks or so? You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
interesting to try to corral this industry that has so much innovation behind it that it really is changing from month to month.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't have a good answer
Yeah,
for that.
yeah,
It is it. This isn't really an answer to your question, but just another thought I had around
yeah.
this, which is it's interesting that Uber and Lyft had basically came to the conclusion that they were okay with a minimum wage of
Yes.
sorts, and I
Just make
think that
sure they're still independent contractors, right?
yeah,
Hmm.
exactly. I think that was they saw the momentum. They saw that regulation was happening one way or the other, so they decided that they were better. They were basically okay with having a minimum wage or some other parameters, so long as the drivers were not classified as employees, because that to them was the kind of their one existential threat. So,
Hmm.
but I think maybe because I haven't heard maybe as many conversations around making some of these food delivery service people employees.
Yeah, right,
I don't know. I haven't followed it super closely, but
right, right.
it is interesting to me that these companies seem to be fighting this a little harder than
Hmm.
Uber and Lyft does, and maybe it's because they don't see quite the same existential threat as.
Yeah,
Um, I mean, there was a lot of momentum toward making Uber and Lyft drivers employees. And
yeah,
so I think it
that's
was
right.
kind of an emergency response to say, okay, we'll be okay with these things, if
Hmm.
not that.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know. Maybe these companies aren't feeling quite the same pressure so they feel like they have the bandwidth to kind of fight any new
Yeah.
regulation.
It'll be interesting to see how this one pans out, because I think you'll hear from the app companies, you'll hear from all the council members. They want to make sure that these gig workers are paid a minimum wage, but it's the path you get that they use to get there that I think is going to be where the devil is very much in the details. So we're going to keep tabs on this. This issue appears to be back on the council's docket May 24th, but plenty of amendments to consider before then. So we're going to keep tabs on this for sure. I wanted to talk about another massive issue from last week. So many different headlines on this one, still sending shockwaves throughout our state and the country. The indication via a leaked document that the U.S. Supreme Court will overturn the 1973 federal ruling to protect abortion rights, Roe versus Wade, and return that decision to the states. So, David, I've heard a lot of local leaders, Governor Inslee, essentially front and center on this one. He's saying he and others are going to fight like hell to make sure the state of Washington remains pro choice. But I just want to know if that truly is at stake here, because I think about our state passed abortion protections in 1970, strengthened that in 1991 with a voter approved statewide measure, the Reproductive Privacy Act. What really changes in Washington state if Roe versus Wade is indeed overturned? Some thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, in immediately, at least as far as regulatory, nothing changes,
Yeah.
and I don't see a time when it would change. I mean, I think realistically, Washington would have to elect probably a Republican governor, Senate, and House, and
Hmm.
all of whom would have to be, uh, anti-abortion,
Hmm.
which
Hmm.
is, I mean, it seems hard to imagine, because even some of the high profile Republicans who have run for governor in the state, I believe, have been pro-choice. I mean, I know
Hmm.
Chris Vance, who ran for Republican Senate against Patty Murray, he no longer considered himself a Republican, but was
Yeah.
pro-choice. And so
Yep.
the sort of power swing that would have to happen for Washington to ban abortion seems pretty unlikely at this point,
Yeah.
and any time in the near future. Of course, things change, and you never know, but really for Washington, I think, and this is pretty widely acknowledged, which will change, is that it shares a border with Idaho,
Yeah. There you go. Hmm.
which has a trigger law,
Hmm.
meaning if and when this draft opinion becomes a final opinion, abortion will basically be illegal in Idaho.
Yeah.
And so then that means a lot for, I would think, especially like Spokane and Pullman, the kind of two big cities along the border there,
Yep.
what that means. And then, going into the future, I think the thing that
Hmm.
I will be interested in watching is it's really going to create a tit for tat situation between these states, which is
Hmm.
Washington is and has already going to probably liberalize rules around medication abortion,
Yes. Hmm.
and sort of being a sanctuary for women
Yeah.
coming from other states.
The
To seek
governor's
an
definitely been
abortion.
talking about that. Yeah. Keep going.
But then you have to imagine that a lot of these Republican states are going to try and do things that would penalize women for taking those kinds of steps.
Yeah.
Which, if to say nothing, obviously there's a lot to be said about abortion, but it is striking that by making this ruling,
Hmm.
you kind of start to understand why it made sense to have national,
Yeah.
federal
Hmm.
regulations around this stuff, because it's going
Yeah.
to get really ugly
Yeah.
when you have these kind of cross state uh, law arms races around
Yeah.
kind of regulating this stuff, and it's
Yeah.
going to be really confusing for the people for whom it matters most.
Yeah, and I think about that with our state. We, of course, passed a measure in 1970, even before Roe versus Wade was on the docket there, to enshrine those kind of rights in our state. So I think you're right, and so much of this, unfortunately, is so speculative because we don't know exactly what the Supreme Court ruling is going to say here. So it's something that a lot of us are talking about. We're going to see what happens in Washington State. We're going to see what happens countrywide on this one because there's still a lot of fallout there waiting to happen. So we'll keep tabs on that. And thanks for your input there, David. All right, I wanted to move on to our next story here. What's it going to be like getting to the San Juans this summer by ferry? Have you considered swimming? Just wanted to throw that out there. We're going to go over the options on Transportation Talk. David, one of your colleagues put together a story about the San Juan Clipper ferry, a foot ferry that goes from Seattle to Friday Harbor, being canceled this summer. And I know you contributed to this piece a little bit too. What's going on here?
I mean, the same thing's going on here that's going on everywhere, which is,
Yeah.
they don't have the staff to do it.
Mm,
Cost of running these things is probably not worth it.
yeah.
So
There's
yeah,
a
I
new
mean,
regulation that's limiting the amount of people they can bring on, apparently. That didn't sound good
right.
either. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, getting to and from the San Juans is going to be really hard. I mean, we should caveat that the San Juan running to Victoria is still
Yeah.
going to run to
Yep. Yep.
Canada,
Yep.
but it's just the San Juans, which it was already getting really hard to run to the San Juans. A
Hmm.
couple weeks ago, one of the ferries had some kind of anchor came loose and punched a hole in
Yes.
the hole, and then that took out one of the boats. And then
Yeah.
the crew shortages on the Washington State ferries are well documented at this
Oh, yeah.
point, meaning the boats are running late. There's a lot of cancellations.
Hmm.
The last week, the reservation system for San Juan ferries went up,
Hmm.
and then promptly crashed.
Oh,
So
boy.
people were scrambling for reservations and couldn't get them. And so,
Mm.
yeah, I mean,
Happy
it's
Mother's
tough,
Day. Yeah. Hmm.
right? It's
Yeah.
tough for those who want to visit, but really, I've got friends who live on Orcas Island, and one of them just had a kid, actually, and
Oh,
watching
wow.
them kind of do the logistical planning around, because they didn't want to have the kid in the San Juans because it didn't really have a fully function, didn't have the
Sure.
hospital system that they wanted. So,
Yeah.
but watching them kind of trying to game plan how to
Oh, boy.
get into Anacortes and make sure that they safely have this child
Wow.
is, really, really eye opening, just how devastatingly complicated and just challenging this is for the people who live over there.
Wow.
Not to mention the cost of just everything going up because of fuel prices to put stuff on the ferry and
Yeah.
delays to put stuff on the ferry. If you're paying a crew hourly to come out and do contract work on your house, they're going to charge you for the time it takes to be on the
Yep.
ferry. And so,
Hmm.
everything really makes life pretty complicated for the people who live out there. And I can live with sacrificing my weekend at
Hmm.
Orcas Island, but I think for the folks out there, I really feel for them. It's
Yeah.
a hard time.
That's going to be an interesting summer for sure. Well, thank you for breaking that down. All right, just to wrap up here, David. So you called out your colleague Mike Lindblom for a great line about construction on I-5 last week, where he noted that drivers have been subjected to a concatenation of cathunks as they drive over the deck of I-5 around Soto. So concatenation from the Latin con, together, catena, a chain. So basically a series of linked events here. I just wanted to know, when a newspaper writer comes up with a fun phrase like that, does the editor like circle it in red and say, "What the hell are you doing?" Or you try to sneak one in and like you win a prize in the newsroom? What's the backstory on this?
I don't know. I mean, I didn't read it until the rest of the world did. I didn't get I
Awesome.
didn't, I do sometimes take little sneak peeks before a story publishes. I had not done that with this one. And
Okay.
uh, he was apparently surprised that it made it through the editing process, but it was he got some applause in the newsroom Slack for that line and making it in. And I think I had tweeted that I wonder if a phrase like this has ever been written or published anywhere. And one of the editors at the Seattle Times did a quick search, and not concatenation of cathunks, of course, is a brand new term, but the word concatenation has made it into the newspaper a couple times. I think you can count on one hand, and it was usually for book reviews is when it had made it into the newspaper. But I'm sure that this is the first time a transportation story has had the word concatenation in it.
I love it. I love it. And I can't wait to see what you're going to come up with next, David. So
Yeah.
the challenge is on. Thank you, sir, as always, for joining me here. Thanks to everybody listening. It's Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. This podcast is available on all the major platforms. And once again, if you are a listener, please do support the show on Patreon. Would be greatly appreciated. Thanks for watching on Converge Media 2. We will see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2022.